Counting to 10. Hello, everyone. I'm Vivien Al Miqdam, and I'm a writer, mostly barista, who lives in DC. I'll be reading my story, The Rightful Queen. And here we go. Naji changed after his 12th birthday, and it worried his sister Nadia. She couldn't remember a single day spent apart from him since they were babies, but now nothing but hide behind the locked door of his room. They used to rip around the backyard, speed their bikes down the hills, tag team video game bosses, choreograph dance routines, and do voices for all the characters in the comic books they loved. Nadia expected Naji to be her steadfast accomplice. His sullen retreat into silence after refusing the birthday party their parents offered to throw him confused her to no end. She tried to talk to him when she could catch him, usually at dinner or the mornings before school, but it felt like he couldn't tear his eyes away from the floor. It was almost as if he'd forgotten all their memories and inside jokes, and he seemed intent on communicating only in mumbled half-sentences and weak grunts. "Don't worry, he's just growing older," Baba said. "Things will change, but he'll be back to normal before you know it." But Nadia wasn't so sure. She decided she needed an expert opinion. Nobody knew more than their weird Aunt Fathan. She lived in Florida and always posted the coolest Instagram shots of herself reading old leather-bound books in her macrame sundresses, or tending her strange assortment of exotic vines, herbs, and cacti, or posing with the diagrams and tables of Arabic letters and numbers that covered the walls of her home. Nadia wasn't sure what Fathan did for work. Baba said she was an amateur scholar of the uncanny, but that sounded like code for something Nadia wasn't supposed to know about. "Are you sure it's puberty?" Fathan asked over email. Plenty of Nadia's friends had already experienced their first periods, and others were already excited by their brand new puny mustache hairs. What was happening with Naji felt different. "If you're certain, Habibti," Fathan replied. Look out for the mail. I'll send you to help you find out. Auntie loves you. XOXO." Exactly 40 days later, Nadia counted. A package arrived from Florida. Inside, Nadia found a chain necklace with a tiny leather bag tied to it and a note which read, "Wear the amulet while both you and your brother are sleeping. Focus on helping him as you fall asleep. Your dreams should give you some answers. Good luck, Habibti." So she did just that. Later that night, focusing with all her will, Nadia scrunched up her eyes and yearned for sleep. Suddenly, she had to shield her face from the hot sun simmering the shining green sand all around her. She stood up, shook the fine sand out of her silk purple tunic and heavy turban, and checked to see if she was still wearing the amulet. She was. She also noticed that a short sword in a tattered leather scabbard also jiggled at her left hip. Nadia bent down and scooped up a handful of sand, letting it flow between her fingers. The thin layer left behind before she dusted it off shimmered like the sheen of algae on water, and felt smooth like flour rather than cork sugar. She had to be dreaming. But when were dreams ever this real? The roll of her collar felt wet to the touch. She was sweating. For a harrowing moment she felt lost. A desert stretched out in all directions without a rock or shrub anywhere, and not even a wisp of cloud marked the perfectly glass sky. The sun hung at its zenith, trapping Nadia's shadow beneath her feet. Peering past the dunes and through the heat monkeys rippling the searing air, she saw a single crystal glinting like a faint beacon on the horizon. No sooner than she decided to set off walking to it, she arrived, as though the emerald desert folded up beneath her feet to deposit her in front of the towering translucent walls. There'd been no rush of wind nor flash of scenery. She had been in one place, and now in another. Incredulous, she looked behind her to see if she could spot where she'd been, but the desert all looked like itself. She chose not to doubt it. She passed through the open gates, made of the same rough crystals as the walls, and found the central thoroughfare leading to an ebony palace that struck out from the city around it like a dark stem rising from a ripe peach. The thoroughfare was crowded with people, animal people specifically. Foxes in doublets, hippos in blacks, and pandas in denim vests jostled against each other and crammed in tight as they brandished placards and pumped their fists. "We, the people, Want the fall of thee, vizier! Freedom for the prince! The clothed beasts chanted in unison. Nadia realized the menage was protesting. She tapped the caftan-wearing owl on the shoulder and asked what everyone was protesting for. The vizier has locked up the rightful young king in the tallest tower of the palace and refuses to let him out. He has taken the sultanate for himself, but we remember the day the king's birth was announced, and we refuse to cooperate with this charlatan. We know who is meant to lead us. I'm looking for my brother. He looks like me and maybe just a little taller. Have you seen him? Nadia asked. No, but if you're looking for someone, then you should go ask the vizier. He owns all the eyes in town, or so the rumor goes. At that the owl pointed with one of his primary feathers at a small hooded figure in blue on a balcony high above the crowd. For a second she wondered up there, but then she realized she was already up there, abruptly transported without her notice in the same way that brought her to the city gates. She stood behind the vizier, watching him glower down at the crowd. Up close she noticed the twinkle embroidering on his robe. As the brick rippled in the wind, he almost seemed to meld with the sky, like he wasn't truly there at all. And then she saw it, he wasn't. Nadia reached down and lifted the hem of the robe to cover a rickety chair with a stack of buckets piled on it. Unless the buckets talk, and it didn't appear they could because they hadn't objected at all to have to find the prince himself. She considered toppling the fake vizier, but who knew how the protesters far below might react, and she didn't need anything near for search. She dropped the fabric back in place, turned her back to the crowd, and proceeded into the palace. The chants from outside faded the deeper into the palace's sturdy stone halls she ventured, and the air turned cold and dry. After wandering for what felt like a long time through a labyrinth of black corridors and rooms, she came across a spiral staircase. This must be the tower, she assured herself, and started to climb. At the top, she found a locked door. Not a castle door or barred iron door, a regular door, much like she'd find in her own house. In fact, the longer she looked at it, the more the door looked like the one to her brother's room. She knocked, but there was no response. Hello? Anyone in there? She shouted, and then pressed her ear to the door. She heard a quick rustle like Baba dropping a load of laundry on the bed, followed by a concerted silence. Someone is in there, and they're for me to leave, she thought. Well, too bad. The prince might deserve privacy, but she wasn't up on her brother over a locked door. If you're not coming out, then I'm coming in, she yelled, and waited. The silence continued, so she jimmied the door open with the blade of her sword and stepped into an opulent bedroom. Brocaded curtains hung in palatial windows, jeweled wallpaper wrapped around the room, and glass animal toys littered the floor. Verdant potted plants sat at every turn, and mahogany shelves inset into the walls overflowed with books and bobs and things of all kind. This is a beautiful room, Nadia thought. In the center, huddled up on the satin sheets of the canopied bed, wearing a ruffled sequin dress that sparkled in a dazzling array of colors, was Naji? Whispered hesitantly. He stared at her, eyes wide and shivering, and then suddenly started to bawl. Naji balled up his fists, pressed them into his face as he stood and wailed, his skirt bunched up like a mushroom cap underneath him. Nadia hopped up onto the bed, threw her arms around him, hugged him tight until his sobbing ebbed. She then pulled his hands away from his face, and that's when she noticed it. His face looked a little less like his, and more like her own. Definitely her brother, but maybe in her dream, he was her sister instead. Neji? She repeated. Nejwa, not Neji. You're the princess? Surprise, she replied with a weak smile. So, you're my sister. Nejwa didn't answer, but she nodded as the tears streamed. Why did you lock yourself in your room? Because they're all expecting a prince, a king, and I'm neither of those things. I'll discipline them all and they'll hate me. But it's your kingdom. You're the true princess. It doesn't matter what they think. This is your sultanate. What if I go out there and it all goes wrong? What if I mess it up? People could invade and destroy the kingdom because there's no king to protect it, or all the people could leave and it'll die from the inside. But if I just stay in here, then it'll all stay just like this. Nadia couldn't help but laugh. Stop laughing at me, Najwa frowned. I'm not, I swear, she reassured her while struggling to stifle her giggles. It's just, look, all that stuff could happen anyway with you locked in here, and that fake vizier pretending to run the place out there. Besides, the world out there isn't going to be satisfied with a robe and some wood pretending to be a man. It's eventually going to find its way in here to find the real you. If you come out, no matter what happens, at least you get to be the queen for as long as that lasts. Najwa stopped crying and gazed into the empty space, invisible gears turning in her head. She sniffed, wiped her face with her palm, and let out a sigh with a smile. I hadn't thought of it. Nadia held out her hand, and her sister took it. She led the queen out of her room, down the stairwell, and through the halls to the balcony. Just as they were about to cross the threshold into the humid sunlight, she woke up. She sat up in bed, rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She fingered the pouch on her necklace with one hand. About the interrupted dream. Suddenly her door burst open, and her brother bounded into her room. They stared at each other for a moment, unsure what to say, until Nadia decided to break the silence. Najwa? Nadia asked. Her brother nodded, which meant that this wasn't her brother, not anymore. Want a hug? At that, Najwa leaped into the bed, and they hugged for the first time in a long while, in the real world, at least. Things didn't go back to the way they were before. It was different now, after all. Najwa stopped hiding away in her room, and Nadia got her sister back without knowing she'd lost her in the first place. Nadia told Najwa all about asking Fathin for help, and reminded herself to text her to say thanks. Maybe she could help me tell Baba about all this, Najwa suggested. Maybe, but she'd have to include directions. He'd get lost in your palace for sure. The two sisters snickered, and they laughed their way into the rest of their lives. The end. All I want to say at this point is I wrote this story so that trans femme children of a Arab or Islamicate background had something, and I hope you all enjoyed it.